Obama, President of the United States, has now announced the end of the combat mission. It was, of course, announced once before by President George Bush with mission accomplished, but this would appear to be the end of it. I'm joined now by Professor of History at the University of Houston, Bob Buzzanco. Professor Buzzanco, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Bob, how do you say it's the end when you leave 50,000 troops behind you?
Exactly, along with a whole lot of private contractors, which is kind of the untold story of the war. This war's been privatized to a great degree, and there's still they just doubled actually in the last 90 days the number of private contractors there. In the Vietnam era, a senator once somewhat seriously said we should just declare victory and get out, and I think that's what Obama just did. He declared victory and got out. But there's a big skeleton crew there. There are private contractors. There are bases. The United States isn't, leaving Iraq anytime soon, totally.
What about the suggestion that the Americans leaving is basically going to mean every Iraqi for himself, that there are now going to be people living in real fear in Iraq because the old guys are going to come back?
I mean, that's certainly a possibility. And I know a lot of Arab diplomats have been talking about that, but we're kind of looking at Iraq now through the prism of the so-called surge, which was really just paying off a bunch of Sunni armies not to fight. But if we look back before that, the darkest days, the deepest problems of 2004, 2005, 2006, I don't see, that it could be worse than that. Clearly, you're going to have, factionalism and sectarian fighting and gangsterism and graft and corruption. The day the U.S. announced leaving, 82 people were killed. And clearly you're going to see that. At the same time, the United States had a bunch of bad options, and I think it took probably the best of all those really bad options. And the people of Iraq, have been an afterthought the whole time, really. So now to suddenly kind of shed these crocodile tears, the people of Iraq are at risk, is somewhat disingenuous by a lot of people, not the humanitarian types.
All right, but what about the situation vis-a-vis Iran? Iran and Iraq went to war. There were hated enemies and everything else. Where will the new Iraq lie in relation to Iran?
Isn't that amazing that a country, that fought a war, a million on each side killed, are now... George Bush has done the impossible. He's brought Iran and Iraq back together. There's been a rapprochement. And Iran now will have heavy, even more influence in Iraq. Maliki and Ahmadinejad have visited and spoken to each other several times. They've spoken well of each other. And Tehran now has a foothold in Iraq, which is utterly unimaginable if you followed the last 25 years. And the U.S., because so much of the saber rattling here in the U.S. has been about Iran. And now what they've essentially done is facilitate Iran's prestige and influence in the region, which isn't really that bad. I mean, the American media talks about how Iran is Iceland and so forth. And I mean, I think the Iranians, Ahmadinejad knows how to play to the crowd. And but Iran is a legitimate force in that region, and it's probably because of this Iraq policy now probably going to become even stronger.
But for those of us who remember Vietnam, admittedly in my case from a long distance away, the American people tired of Vietnam. And once the American people tired of it, it was going to be very difficult for Nixon and Johnson to keep the war going. Have the American people tired of Iraq? Is that?
Oh, absolutely. There's absolutely heavy war fatigue. I mean, Iraq has been an afterthought, and even Afghanistan, which is far hotter, isn't really a big issue here. I mean, in the United States, people are worried about their jobs and the economy, and the wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, even terrorism, really are secondary by a large ratio. Now, the country's tired of it. They've just fatigued of it, and they want to move on.
I mean, by World War II or even Vietnam terms, the losses are infinitesimal. The military losses: 4,500 men killed, 32,000 wounded. What about a story I read this week that the psychological damage appears to be horrendous amongst returning American troops in terms of, at its best, marriage breakdown or alcoholism or whatever, but at its worst, murders and all sorts of things. How real is that?
Oh, it's absolutely real. In fact, the VA has actually taken some steps now to help soldiers with PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock. The number of vets. See, one of the ironies is one of the reasons those numbers of soldiers killed is as small as it is comparatively, is because the technology of medicine has gotten so much better on the field. So they're saving a lot of young men who would have died in Vietnam or in World War II. And they're coming home with these, really horrible, catastrophic, multiple injuries, including psychological injuries. The number of suicides is skyrocketing. You're right. At Fort Bragg alone, there have been 9 or 10 soldiers who killed their wives. Alcoholism, drug use. The system is going to be overwhelmed. The war has probably cost $1 trillion already, but some really reputable economists have said just caring for the soldiers is probably going to raise that, through the years up to maybe $3 trillion. So absolutely, it's just a harrowing experience. They were fighting, hand to hand, house to house combat. They saw people blown up in front of them. It's harrowing. It's terrible.
Okay. Bob, earlier we played part of the Obama speech. I'm not sure how smart Joe Biden is on it, but this is what the vice president, who spoke at a military ceremony yesterday, this is what he had to say.
Last week, after 7.5 years that tested our mettle like no conflict in recent American history, the last of our combat units followed that same dusty highway out of Iraq on their way home.
Yeah, but they really are playing with words here. When he says the last of our combat troops and there's 50,000 remaining, what are the ones who are remaining? The catering corps or the payroll corps or what?
Well, that word, actually, the word combat's crucial. Advisors, so-called advisors, I always say that with quotes around it. Engineers, yes, accountants, arms technicians. I mean, the U.S., I forget how many bases, over a dozen. The U.S. isn't going to simply leave those bases and let the Iraqis or the Iranians take them over. So these are allegedly non-combatants, and they did this in Vietnam all the time, too. So they would call them advisors. But, they have guns, and they can pick them up and use them. They're going to go out on missions. They're going to train Iraqi forces. They're going to be paying off Iraqi politicians. The number of American fatalities is going to, become nearly zero now. It's going to be very, very, very low, which is the real point. And, but otherwise, it's still very much an American presence there. And like I said, private contractors, the Blackwater, Halliburton types will be in there in larger numbers. Like they've doubled in the last 90 days.
So in effect, you have mercenaries in there rather than soldiers then?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And they're paid better. They're paid much better than soldiers are.
What about, the nasty word Al-Qaeda? I'm reading that, they seem to be hugely involved. Is that so? Does this represent a comeback then for the bad guys? Is that finally what's going to happen?
It's hard. So much misinformation and disinformation is out there about Al-Qaeda. It wouldn't be surprising. The U.S. created those conditions under which Al-Qaeda can recruit and thrive. It's like the mosque controversy here in New York, which is really playing right into the hands of people who are already predisposed not to like you. And so it wouldn't surprise me whether it's Al-Qaeda, or a Shia army or the Mahdi army or something like that. The United States has created conditions under which those kinds of groups, call them terrorist groups or whatever, are going to prosper. And so I think we know there's a huge Al-Qaeda presence in Pakistan, which is probably the most dangerous place in the world right now. And if it's in Iraq, I don't think anybody would be surprised by that. Getting real numbers anymore, I just don't trust anything the government or media says because I'm not sure anybody knows. But that type of ideology is clearly gonna prosper.
Thank you so much for joining me, Professor of History at the University of Houston, Bob Buzzanco.